Let me start with a question. How many of you remember your teenage years? Okay, pretty much everybody. How would you describe them? Give me a couple of words to describe your teenage years.
Fun.
Fun, okay. Awkward. That's one that I completely agree with.
Clueless.
So the reality is that startups that have had an initial success and are starting to grow go through a similar stage. It's this awkward stage where they really need to change to take advantage of the opportunity, but those changes can be very difficult. As was mentioned, I'm Laura Marino. I'm SVP of Product at Lever. I have over 15 years driving product teams in large and small organizations, and what I have found is that I'm really passionate about working with companies that are going through this high growth sort of teenage stage. And what I want to do tonight is share with you a little bit how startups evolve, what are the differences between startups that are in the early stage and startups that are going through this high growth teenage stage, primarily from the product perspective, but actually also from the overall business perspective. I do believe that people who are in product have to be very, very much involved with the whole business because product is really the glue between all of the components of the company. So startups typically go through 3 stages. There is an early stage, also called the search stage. There's a high growth stage that I call the teenage stage. And then there's an adult stage that's they are sometimes known also as the search stage, the build stage, and the grow stage. In the early stage, the company is still searching. The startup is an early startup searching for product market fit, searching for a repeatable business model. They need to move fast, they need to iterate, and potentially they may need to pivot. During that early stage, the company is essentially a temporary organization searching for the right business model. And their approach is to really do whatever it takes to get the company off the ground. In the adult stage are mature startups, many of which would have already gone through a liquidity event. Maybe an IPO, maybe they were acquired and are part of an M&A. These are companies that have a more mature business model. They are growing through more established processes. And the focus of those companies is actually to execute on a proven business model. And then in between, you have this awkward, high-growth teenage stage. In that stage, the startup is no longer looking for product market fit. They have found product market fit, but now they need to scale. And they need to scale their customers and their users at a rate and in a way that will eventually allow them to be cash positive. There's no clear line separating when a startup ends the early stage and starts the teenage stage, but there are some indicators. One could be based on the size of the company. Typically, by the time a startup gets to 40, 60 people, they are starting to grow, but also the revenue and probably where they are in the terms of the funding. Typically, companies will get a Series A when they can prove that they have gotten to product market fit. After that, they start scaling, and that's when they get into a Series B or C. And also in terms of revenue, by the time a company is in the teenage stage, they have some recurring stable revenue. So I don't know if how many of you have seen this from CB Insights. So CB Insights is a research organization here in Silicon Valley, and they do a lot of analysis on startups. And this was a study they did. They essentially looked at 1,098 U.S. companies that got seed funding between 2008 and 2010. And they followed them through 2017. And they looked in each stage, after each round of funding, how many companies had been able to have a successful exit, how many had been able to continue and successfully get the next round of funding, and how many failed to raise. And those that fail to raise essentially die or become sort of a self-maintained small companies. So if you look at this, and the second round is typically the A round of funding after A seed. So companies that fail in that first stage are early stage companies. They probably were not able to prove to investors that they had achieved product market fit. They failed to raise the next round. But from those, and 40% of companies failed in that first round. But then from those that survived, those that probably had proven that they had achieved product market fit and got into what I call the teenage stage, and they were moving towards the B or C round of funding, almost 60% of those that had survived that first stage fail. And the question is why? Why is it that companies that had successfully sort of survived that early stage are failing in this high growth stage? Well, the reason why startups fail to raise when they are in the high growth stage is because the investors are looking for things that are different than what they were looking for when they were looking at the A round of funding. So the reality to understand why this happens means we need to go back to look at the early stage strategies. The early stage strategies, from the product perspective, the early stage is one in which the startup is moving fast, iterating, potentially having to pivot. They are focused on just getting features out as fast as they can so that they can prove value to the customers. They are not worried about scalability or reliability because really they need to get some value for the customer out. And especially in B2B, they're very, very focused on securing those early adopters that will help them really define the product and that will serve as their reference customers, which is incredibly valuable if you are in B2B. But that means that they may be willing to do things for those early customers that may not be as interesting for the rest of the market. But you need to do that to secure them. From a culture perspective, a company that's in the early stage is in this do whatever it takes. Everybody will wear multiple hats. The CEO may be the most successful salesperson. And you have a couple of people who know a lot about the company. There's a lot of this tribal knowledge. Information is communicated very informally. Everything is very efficient because it's a small team. They all talk to each other. But when you start scaling, when you start moving beyond those 40 people or 30 people in the early stage, and you start also adding 10 times as many customers, really this stops working, and what you end up having is this very complex situation. So the reality is that for companies that are starting this high growth stage, for them to be successful, they really need to make some critical transitions. They need to change because what had gotten them to that first early stage is not going to get them to the next stage. And so there are 5 key transitions that startups have to do in order to successfully now navigate this high growth teenage stage. And I'm going to talk about each of those. Some of those are less related to product, some are very much related to product, and I would claim that product management will have to be involved in all of them and will be responsible for driving some of the most critical ones. So let's start with moving from people to process. Process typically is a bad word. When you say process to a startup, it's like, oh no, this is bureaucracy. It's going to slow us down. But the reality is that in an early stage startup, again, people are wearing so many hats. The knowledge about the company, the knowledge about the product, the knowledge about the customers is in the brains of this early team that knows everything. And as the company starts growing, as the number of customers start growing, that team becomes a bottleneck. They're the ones who know how to do things. So you need to start moving that knowledge in that core team to the processes. That means starting to put processes across a variety of functions. And it means putting documentation on the product, on the coding, but also documenting HR processes, documenting the sales comp plans. A lot of the things that are so informal early on as you grow, you need to start formalizing. And one of the things that many startups don't realize, but it has to be formalized, is culture. Here in Silicon Valley, a lot of the startups really start with a very strong feeling of what their culture should be. And it's part of what is used to attract the candidates that are going to become their employees. But there's also this naive belief that culture will continue to propagate as the company grows. And that doesn't happen. So one of the things that a startup has to start thinking about is how are they going to propagate that culture and make sure that as they hire new employees, they will be able to reflect the values and the culture. And you do that through processes like the onboarding, the recruiting. You start really embedding in those processes the values that the company has so that the new employees really understand what the company is about. But it does take a lot of effort. My previous company, Topia, was also in the HR tech space. We had a very complex platform for helping companies relocate employees, and it connected the HR people with the vendors that do the moves with the employee that's being relocated. And we started growing pretty fast, and we made an acquisition in Estonia, and we had a team in London, and we had a team in San Francisco, and then we made an acquisition in Seattle. And then we realized that there was no understanding of the values or the culture. And there had to be a really big effort from the executive team to start kind of repropagating what the values were. But you don't want to get to that point. You really want, as you start growing, you want to make sure that you start putting in place the processes that are going to allow your new employees to know what the company is about. So then we moving from relationships to brands. In B2B especially, a lot of the initial customers come through relationships. Maybe the CEO or even the investors put people in contact and you start getting these initial customers. Maybe the sales team has a couple of those rainmakers that had a fabulous network of people they knew, and those people start selling the product. But as you grow, you have to move from having sales that's based purely on relationship to a sales that's based on the brand of the company. The company now has to be recognized in the market and the value that the company has to provide. This is the time when startups really need to start investing in building out a strong sales team, again, especially if you're in B2B, and also a strong marketing team, because now is the time in order to grow, it cannot be done by one relationships. Now, the next one is, of course, product. And you can think about it moving from projects to product. I think about it more from moving from what's the early product to a scalable product. And so to go back to see what are the challenges that a startup that's going through this fast growth stage faces when it comes to product, and you go back yet again to see what was the approach in the early stage. So again, we said the company in the early stage has to really move fast and iterate. What that means is that there's still time to focus on building a scalable architecture. There's no time to really, from the engineering perspective, do things that are very long-term reliable, because the premium is on speed and getting something out in the market. And it's okay to do shortcuts from the technical perspective. It's okay to do some hacks. Again, the focus is all on features that are visible to the customer. So that means that there's no time for engineering to work on tools that will help an implementation team or a partner get the product live with customers. There's probably minimum configurability because it's easier to kind of hard code things. But it's all done because the priority at that point is really for producing things that are visible to the customer. And again, securing the early adopters. Very important, but securing early adopters typically means that and this is something that product managers hate to do, but they will have to do it in an early stage, is accepting to do certain things for those key customers that you as a product manager may know are not really ideal for the whole market. Probably the whole market doesn't want that, But if the customer that's so critical needs that, you're going to have to do that, and you end up with features that are pretty customer specific. So pretty much at the end of this early stage, if your product were a house, it would look something like this. It would have a bunch of stuff that's customer-specific functionality. It might have been built as part of the code. It's not custom code. It's part of the code, but only a couple of customers will use it. It will have a bunch of stuff that's built very kind of flaky, technical debt, stuff that was built very quickly because of urgency. And it will have a bunch of stuff that's not even fully built. And again, this is very much what happens, especially in B2B, because B2B products typically need implementation. And what you want is a services organization to implement the product for the customer, to configure it for the customer. But building the interfaces that will allow a services team to actually go and configure takes more effort than having engineering go and configure every time you have a new customer. So what happens is that, again, at Topia, we had such a complex product, and we're building out a lot of functionality. And what happened was, every time we signed a new big customer, there were pieces of the configuration that could only be done by the engineering team because they needed kind of getting into the database. And so the services organization was able to do some pieces, but at the end of the day, for every customer that was going live, engineering had to dedicate time to complete the configuration because it was easier, faster to do that than having to build the tools. Well, that doesn't scale. If you start getting 100 customers, 500, 1,000 customers, you can't put your engineering team to do that. So let's go one by one and look at kind of why the problem exists and what you can do about it. So again, customer-specific functionality. Why? As we said, those early customers are very, very critical. They really are important for a startup as the references, as the customers that help them define the product. So they start as these great partners, but they get accustomed to pretty much dictating the roadmap. And so it's very dangerous that after a while you have a bunch of those important customers, every single one of them telling you what they want in the roadmap, and pretty much implying you better do that. It is very hard for people in product to say no to those customers. They will have a relationship with the CEO most likely, but you have to, because otherwise they will completely take over your roadmap. So a couple of things that I've seen worked. In one of my other companies, I worked for a company called Intap that provided software for the largest law firms in the world. Our target market were the 1,000 largest law firms in the US, UK, and Australia. And we had a whole suite of products that were specific for operations of legal firms. And as you can possibly imagine, large law firms feel they are the most important company ever, each of them. And they had very strong opinions of what we needed to build. And of course, they did not agree. Each one wanted something different. So what we found was helpful was we started creating these customer council meetings where we proactively would go and share what was in the roadmap. So the first thing is you start proactively telling them what's coming instead of waiting for them to tell you what they want. But also by having them in a group of peers, it was interesting to see that they started seeing that what they wanted didn't necessarily resonate with the others in the group. So the dynamics are a little bit different. It's not me as the product manager saying what you want is really not good for the market. Is that customer hearing that their peers are not really seeing that as a need. So it's never easy, but you have to be able to do that. In Topia, we had some of the similar things that those customers really wanted some very specific functionality that wasn't important for the rest of the market, and they would get very upset. But as we kind of try to bring them back to, we're building a product for the market, it's in your best benefit to make sure that this product really serves the whole market, and that's why we have this roadmap. You can start slowly pulling them back. Sometimes you may have to risk losing one of those customers. But if you're in the high growth stage, if that customer already has served this great purpose of being your reference, but they're becoming a big blocker to what you want to do to grow the market overall, you may have to be willing to lose that customer. And again, it's a tough decision, but it is the one that will allow you to move forward. Technical debt. Why technical debt? I think everybody knows, everybody who's worked with engineering knows that there's technical debt. Technical debt really refers to the cost of all of the shortcuts, all of the things that were done in a rush in order of expediency, but that eventually start not working very well. And it is natural for every startup to have some level of technical debt. If, as a startup in the early stage, your engineering team starts trying to build everything perfectly, totally scalable, you will probably never get your first product to the market. You'll run out of money before that. So it is totally natural that you have technical debt. The problem happens when you start scaling and you don't address that technical debt, because it's going to catch up with you. In the most benevolent way, technical debt starts showing up as making the engineering team less efficient. Because if you start building functionality on top of something that was not very robust, things start breaking. So the development of new functionality gets slowed down by things that start breaking in fragile pieces. But it's even worse when the technical debt starts impacting customers and starts being visible to customers. At Intap, again, this company where we were developing software for the legal industry, we decided to come out with a new product. It's a product that every large law firm needs. When they bring in a new client, they need to make sure that bringing on that client is not going to put them in conflict with other clients that they have, or in conflict because of people involved with that company. If they are starting to get into helping them with lawsuits, they really need to be very careful to see if there are any conflicts of interest why the law firm shouldn't take on that client. We were late to market with that product. There were already products in the market. We had a big competitor. So we really went in with a lot of functionality. We had to meet the bar in terms of what existed, and then we had to provide new functionality that was better than the competitors. And we did, and we successfully started displacing the competitors in those very large firms. But then, as those large firms started using our conflicts product, they started having awful performance. We had not realized that their conflict searches were so big, and the search would take 2 minutes or 3 minutes. And so the customers that started using our product started complaining. Law firms talked to each other. Our sales pipeline froze. A lot of those other customers that were in the pipeline, like, oh, your product's not ready. We actually had to make the decision to stop every new feature development and just focus on performance for an entire quarter. And we were able to do that, and we were able to recover those customers and unblock our pipeline. But again, law firms move slowly, and B2B is slower. When you have this happen in a B2C product, it can kill your company. I don't know if many of you know Dan Olson. I think he's spoken here and he has a book. But he was part of a very early social networking company that existed before MySpace. It was called Friendsters. And they had started with kind of as this social network, and all of a sudden they started having this great success, and friends were recommending, and a lot of people started signing up on their platform, and performance started going down. And B2C is such that if the customer has a bad experience, they're not going to come back. The consumers don't have the patience, or there's no reason why they would come back. And I think that was one of the biggest reasons why the company failed. So the importance of starting to address technical debt when you start scaling becomes really, really critical. And the question is, so how do you do that when you're also being pressured to come up with new functionality? And I call that taking the medicine. you have to start realizing that you're going to have to reallocate your engineering resources. And you, as the product person in the company, have to be the one communicating that to the executives, communicating that to sales. When I started Intopia, I came in as head of product, and the first thing that I heard from the rest of the executive team was that the engineering team was not delivering, that they would promise things, but then they would never deliver. And when I started drilling deeper at what was happening, the reality is that the engineering team had been essentially operating in this way. They were delivering primarily new functionality very quickly. But it was a complex product, so they were being pulled into helping with implementations and escalations. And of course, when you deliver functionality, there's never a feature that's done when you are done with version 1. There's always enhancements that need to be done. So there was some maintenance going on. But as the company started growing and they started getting more and more customers, the reality is that the time that engineering had to spend on maintenance and implementation and escalations was much, much higher than they had calculated. And they were not tracking it. They were being pulled into emergency, they were being pulled into implementations, but they had still promised that they were going to be delivering features as if they were in the early stage. So the reality is that you have to realize that given a bandwidth of engineering, as the company starts scaling, you have to make sure that you are allocating engineering bandwidth to start addressing the technical debt, to start doing maintenance on the features that you release so that customers feel that, yes, it is the right feature, instead of just kind of saying, we do it once and we don't touch it again. And you have to start working on actually creating tools that will allow a services organization to take on the role of implementing, because you cannot have your engineering team be pulled into every single implementation of the product. But again, this needs communication. This is not visible to the executives. It's not visible to the sales team. The sales just wants more. They keep asking for more. Customers ask for more. So the part of the responsibility of the product management team is to explain why we need to now start allocating engineering differently, why we now are going to promise fewer new features because we're going to be addressing some of this. So this is primarily on the product side. The next change is moving from ownership to partnership. When companies start, they want to own the entire relationship with the customer. They want to make sure that everything is perfect, and that is the right thing. But as companies start scaling, there's an opportunity to step back and say, what are things that are really core to the value that we're providing, and what are things that we actually could partner on so that we focus our own resources on what's most important. And partnerships come in different flavors. You may have partnerships for the distribution and implementation. So you may start building a whole set of partners that will take on the responsibility for implementation. We did that at Intap. When I started, we had a set of products, and our company, would do all of the implementation. Now, we had a services team doing the implementation. We had enough configurability in the product that engineering didn't have to get involved. But as we started growing as a company, our services team had to grow a lot. And if you're a software company, that has investment, you're valued for the software and for the premium on the software. You don't want to become a big services organization. So what we ended up doing once we had a pretty big suite of products and had proven success, we started encouraging partners to come up and become trained on how to implement our products. And we were very successful because our partners became successful. They were building a business around implementing our products, but that allowed us as a company to not be hiring a lot of services people and instead focus on hiring engineering and product people to really advance the product and have others do the services. Now, there are other types of partnerships where I would say product is even more critical. The decisions on build versus buy have to be driven in many ways by the product organization, because the product team is the one that knows best. Now, here's a thing with engineering. A lot of engineering teams that I know have this not invented here syndrome. They want to do everything. But there are parts of the product potentially that are better done by somebody else. Topia, for example, the platform we had was very, very complex. Again, we had the HR people coming in and defining the benefits for somebody who was going to be relocated. We had the employee coming in to see what they were going to get. We had the vendors plugging in to offer their services. And we manage a lot of the payments to the vendors, and we manage payments to remote employees. And that was very complex. And we started having big issues. The product didn't have too much functionality, so a lot of the finance team that was managing that had spreadsheets, and it just became really difficult. So we were going to have to make a decision that we put all of our engineering in fixing that part of the product that really wasn't visible to the customers, or we figure out a way to partner. And we end up partnering with a company that was specializing in that type of financial pieces. We integrated with them, so we could send all of the information, they would send information back, but they had their team managing payments. So it is one of those decisions that you can have to step back and say, where do I put my engineering resources? And in what cases is it better for me to have a partner that we can integrate it, even on the technology side? And then the last one, which is also very important, is moving from being opportunistic to being strategic. Young companies that are trying to find product market fit have to be very opportunistic. They are trying different things. They are pivoting. If a customer that's helping them says, oh, but you should also do this, the company may start kind of doing additional functionality. But once you are scaling, you really need to focus on what are the areas that you need to grow. And moving to being strategic has two components that could seem somewhat contradictory. On one hand, you have to focus, and you have to decide what to stop doing. Again, you might have started these little side things because some of your initial customers wanted you to increase the product in one area. But if the product market fit for the broader market is in just one of your products on one of the areas, that's what you want to do, double down on that and stop working on those other side projects. But as you do that, you also have to start looking longer term at how you're going to grow. Typically, especially for VC-backed companies, investors are very demanding. They really want to make a lot of money out of their investment. And they want to see a level of growth that is not likely to happen just with the initial product that you came up with. So the company, but again, here's where product has a lot to say to, has to start figure out what is this future, what's this vision, how are we going to grow? And here's where you have things like starting to think about, are you going to have a platform play? Are you going to start expanding to adjacent markets? Intapp was very interesting because when I joined Intapp had niche products that were sold to the law firms as really kind of specialized little pieces. As we started growing, we started filling in the entire suite of the products that were needed for a law firm to operate. And then we realized we need to grow more than just, the legal market is pretty limited, but we started realizing that there were adjacent markets that had similar complexities in terms of compliance, conflicts with clients. So we started expanding into adjacent markets and expanding the product suite to be more of a more generic professional services suite. But it is something that you need to start thinking about. And if the company is going to go out for raising more money, there has to be a story to be told to the investors of how you're going to get from this initial product where you're focusing the energy right now because that's where you're scaling, but what's going to be your next story. So that's kind of the looking at expansion. So to step back, again, I think that product, in my opinion, being in product is the most exciting role that you can have in any company of any size. But if you are in this fast-growing startups, product has a very, very significant role, not just in executing the today, but also helping the company move to that next stage and help the company navigate these transitions that may be a bit painful. So my recommendation, if you are interested in working in one of those fast-growing startups, is that you be prepared and embrace the change. It's a lot of fun. So that's it. I think that was faster than I thought.